Hello, I'm Matthew Frank, Director of the Simon Center on Religion and the Constitution at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. I'm filling in for Professor Robert George, the founder of the American Principles Project. Professor George, as many EWTN viewers may know, was recently hospitalized. He is, however, recuperating nicely and is grateful for everyone's prayers. While he's away, I'm your host for Candidate Conversations. Candidate Conversations features in-depth, one-on-one conversations with 2016 presidential candidates on the important issues of moral and constitutional principle facing American Catholics and our fellow citizens today. Our guest today is former Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Senator. Thanks for being with us.
It's good to be here. Thank you, Matt.
I want to begin.
And my prayers go out to Robbie. What a great man and a great leader. So he gave us a little scare, so it's good to see he's doing better.
He did give us a little scare, but he's mending nicely.
I'm glad to hear that.
I know he appreciates your prayers.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you what you think are the principles, ideals, institutions that you regard as the pillars of our civilization. Are they under assault today, threat of any kind? If so, by whom or by what? And what do you think it will take to defend or rebuild those pillars?
Well, unfortunately, I think they're pretty much all under assault. The principal pillar is that of faith. I don't think there's any question that hostility toward faith generally and the Judeo-Christian principles of our country, Christianity specifically, all of those are under assault. I always hesitate to use the term assault or attack because when you look across the ocean and you see ISIS, beheading people, crucifying people, it doesn't compare to what's going on over there. But you see the signs of a change of heart here in America. This idea that faith is at the center of our moral enterprise as a country, not just as a family, but as a country. And that, the Democratic Party in the last convention trying to strike the word God from their platform. I mean, it's that type of secularism that is making, candidates like me unusual, because I'll talk about faith and I'll actually have a discussion about how faith is an important part of our pray, and I'm very open about prayer and all of those things which used to be a given in American politics. It didn't matter what party you were in. They were just sort of the central part of, I always say America is not an ethnicity, it's a set of values and principles. And we are our collective, the idea of America is a collection of principles and values that we hold, and those are changing. Yeah. And it's foundation shaking from my perspective, and the result, you're starting to see the result on a variety of different fronts, not the least of which is the family. Yeah. That institution, which is the pillar of civil society, the pillar of, I would argue, the foundation which allows for limited government. If you have strong families and problems are dealt with at the level closest to the person involved, you don't need bigger and bigger. You don't need all these layers of government coming in and intruding into everybody's life. But now you're seeing more and more of that. Why? In part because of this basic foundational unit, the family, crumbling. Now I saw a statistic recently that a majority of children being raised in America are going to be raised without a father, effectively a father in the home. How do you as a society function and thrive when children are being abandoned by key people in their lives and being replaced by, in many cases, government or by the state? And this is a very deep concern. So I can go on, the impact on our Constitution and that sort of those foundational principles are being discarded, particularly some of the more important ones like religious liberty and the like. All of those things are very disquieting for, I think, many people. The folks who don't seem to be disquieted are young people who I'm not too sure realize what's being lost. I mean, if you don't know what you have, it's hard to see it. If our age, you're younger than I am, but someone my age, you can look back and say, oh wow, look at what's happened. If you're if your perspective is a pretty narrow one, it's hard to see what we've lost.
Yeah, we began this country in 1776 by saying that we were guided by the laws of nature and of nature's God,
Yeah.
that we hold truths to be self-evident about our relation to the Creator and to one another, and that's slipping away, I think I hear you say.
Oh, no question about it. I regularly, actually for the last several years, even in the first campaign when I ran, I always cited the Declaration of Independence and how these self-evident truths are no longer truisms anymore. And the impact of that, the consequence of that is pretty dramatic. And I think we've seen that happen even more as basic institutions of our society. The truth of what man-woman marriage is has now been destroyed, really. Right. The foundation upon civil society has been destroyed, and I shouldn't say it's been destroyed. It's been further destroyed because it was in the process of destruction for a long time, and now, as I always say, the nail has been placed in the coffin that this issue is now completely deconstructed.
Well, and here in the year that is the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report, which warned about the fatherlessness problem in the black community, which is now metastasized into.
And it was 25%.
Right.
It was 25%, and Moynihan was warning about the disasters.
Yeah.
You know, nationwide, it's almost 40%. Right. And if you look at the community that Moynihan was talking about, 70 to 75%. Right. I mean, marriage is the exception, not the rule.
But in this anniversary year, the Supreme Court declared fathers optional. Declared parents of the two sexes, complementary couples, as the unit of the family optional.
They basically said marriage is no longer about children.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with kids.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that a majority, here's another number that all these statistics, that a majority of children born out of wedlock in America today are born with the father living in the home.
Oh, yeah.
Now think about that. Right. So you have men and women together cohabitating, having children, but not getting married.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things come to mind. Number one, why would you get married? Because marriage has nothing to do with children.
Right.
So the fact that you're having children, if you happen, I mean, you're cohabitating, you're, obviously sleeping together, and so if children come around, that really doesn't change anything because marriage isn't about man, woman, children, raising, all those types of things. And secondly, the government actually creates incentives for you not to marry, particularly if you're lower income, because the ability for a father to be in the home, file a separate tax return, mom, who may not be working full-time or working part-time, obviously having a child, you're probably not working full-time, and be able to get government benefits as a result of that. But if you were married, you'd lose those benefits. So the government not only has put things in place like these Supreme Court decisions, which has made marriage not about children, but they actually fund the separation of men and women.
The dysfunction. They fund the dysfunction, which then they try to solve, but can't. Well, speaking of the protection of children, leads me to my next question. The 14th Amendment, as you know very well, says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And the amendment, as you know, also specifically empowers the Congress in Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Now, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask, do you believe unborn babies are persons whose equal right to life is protected under the 14th Amendment? Would you call on Congress to use this Section 5 authority to protect the unborn? Or do you believe that you're obligated to defer to the declaration of majority now 40 plus years ago in Roe versus Wade, unless and until Roe is overturned by a future decision of the court or a constitutional amendment? Is there something that can be done now?
I mean, if you go back to what is the definition of person, which of course isn't defined in the Constitution. And so here's the reality. The reality is there's no doubt that the child in the womb is a human being. Okay, there's no scientific argument at the moment of conception that child in the womb is a human being. The question is it a person under the Constitution? And do we separate persons from human beings? And that's...
There's huge consequences of doing that.
Right. I mean, and so that's really the question. I don't think anyone would say that child, anyone who's being honest, would say that child in the womb is not a human being. The question is whether it's a person under the Constitution. And when does person, is being a human being different than being a person?
Yeah.
And under the law, the construct is yes. Yes, it is. I mean, that's what Roe versus Wade said, that you can be a human being, but you're not a person until we decide to bestow those rights, which of course is the ultimate horrible slippery slope.
These are unpersons until
these are unpersons
later to be determined.
Exactly. And so where do you draw that line? And do you draw that line as, Peter Singer would draw it, your colleague at Princeton, who would say, well, the woman has a year to determine whether she wants to keep her child or not, whether that person,
after birth.
After birth.
Yeah.
And so that's really the central question. And I think, and I've said this over and over and over again, that we need to err on the side of being open and welcoming and accepting of all of God's creation. All human beings should be considered persons, and that we should have a very bright line, because once you move that line away from a person and a human being are the same,
right, then
it's up to 5 judges or a Congress or whoever, a president, to determine where we move that line. And so I've always taken the position that we have an obligation to push back on a court that got it wrong back in and a court that got it wrong on the gay marriage issue just this year. That both of those decisions were an act of judicial tyranny and judicial supremacy, and that other branches of government have an obligation to confront that. Because if I were to be successful as president of the United States, I get up and I take an oath of office. And I swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. I don't take an oath to say I uphold and defend the Supreme Court's determination of what the Constitution says. I have to look at that Constitution and I have to decide to uphold and defend it. You say, well, wait a minute. That can result in tyranny. That the President of the United States can determine what the Constitution says and act accordingly and do things that the Supreme Court says they can't do. What's the impact of that? Well, the impact is actually much less severe to a society than when a court does it. And the reason I say that, the reason I say that is because within 4 years or less, the country can say, you're out of here. We're getting rid of you because we believe that you've abused your office and you've violated the Constitution. If the president has gone astray, then there is a Congress, and there is a court, and there is ultimately the American public. When the court goes astray, particularly now given longevity of our species right now, I mean, the average person lives to about 80 years of age. Person gets on the court now is usually about 40 or 50. So you got 30, 40 years potentially of these people being on the court. And there isn't the opportunity for society, for our country to say, okay, you've overreached, we need to do something about it. And so I'd rather put the onus on the president to defend to the American public than giving the court that authority.
Right. Well, it's the people's constitution and an official answerable more readily to the people than these justices. I mean, they're in principle impeachable and all that, but it's extremely difficult.
That's a lot harder than an election. The idea of, because impeachment is not a, I mean, it's a political solution. It's not no different than an election. It's just a much higher hurdle to be able to get done than an election.
Yeah. Now, your answer to that question it sets me up perfectly for the next one.
Okay.
It really does, because we're already talking about the problem of judicial supremacy and what the other institutions of government can or cannot do about it. No one denies, our friends on the left don't deny, that the Supreme Court sometimes gets the Constitution wrong. I think most people would agree that they were wrong about slavery and the rights of black persons in Dred Scott. in 1857. They were wrong over a century ago, many of us believe, to overturn worker protection legislation in Lochner versus New York. And of course they were wrong in Dred Scott, in Roe versus Wade in 1973. This year the Supreme Court imposed same-sex marriage on the country in Obergefell versus Hodges. So how should a president or Congress respond when the Supreme Court usurps the authority of the people and their elected representatives by issuing edicts lacking any warrant in the text, the logic, the structure, or the original understanding of the Constitution? I want to sort of home in on a very precise way of addressing the problem here.
Yeah.
Some people say that a president must always accept the court's interpretation of the Constitution. You've just said already that you don't think that's right. But many people say that it's the law of the land, binding not just on the parties to the case, but on all public officials, including presidents. Abraham Lincoln vehemently disagreed with this. He said in his first inaugural address that to treat unconstitutional court rulings as binding law would be tantamount to the American people, quote, resigning their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. And Lincoln acted on this belief. He supported and signed legislation that banned slavery in all federal territories, contradicting Dred Scott, and he issued passports and patents, his administration did, to free black Americans, defying the ruling of the court that they were not to be considered citizens. Was Lincoln right or wrong? Do you agree with his rejection of judicial supremacy? Or do you side with people who say, well, public officials must treat Supreme Court rulings as binding law, even that they regard as themselves violating the Constitution? How would you treat Obergefell?
Yeah, I think that's the key. You have a strong, not just colorable claim, but you have a strong claim that what the court has done is violative of the Constitution. The Supreme Court may rule on a variety of different issues. I don't like their decision. It may be on private condemnation of private property for eminent domain. I may not like, but the idea that I would say, well, or on a First Amendment case where they limit speech one way or another. I mean, there may be things that you may have a colorable claim saying, well, I don't necessarily agree with the way they interpreted the Constitution there. But the question is, did they bring in a right that doesn't exist? Did they just not interpret the Constitution, but ignore the Constitution?
Sure.
And that's a different matter. So I just want to make sure that I'm not unclear here. I don't think that that judicial review is a rogue doctrine. I think judicial review is fine.
Right.
But the whole concept of judicial review was the whole role of the judiciary was to be limited.
Right. And
it was to deal with the case at hand, to be advisory to others, but to always, I'm a lawyer, and so always remember that as a judge was to make your decision as limited as possible to resolve the matter at hand. Don't use cases to decide great problems dealing with the world and use those cases to change the Constitution or change law. And that's where the court's gone astray. The court's decided that now they're the great arbiter. They're the great supreme legislature, and that they're going to solve all these problems out here instead of dealing with the case before them, dealing with the issues as limited as possible to resolve the case. That's gone, and that's created this problem. So when you hear me say, as I will, that I think it is the role of the president to put the court back in the position it should, which is not the final arbiter, not the creator of all these rights, not the inventor or the amender of the Constitution. I don't do so out of a desire to grab power and authority.
Yeah.
I do so because the court has decided that they are going to exert themselves and become a disproportionate voice on the national stage, and one that our founders never intended, and one that is not good for our country or for a republic to begin with. So the answer to your question is that by way of background, when they have exceeded their authority and acted outside of the Constitution, it is incumbent upon the president to do something about it. And so the answer is yes. I would confront the court. Everything from, for example, on the issue of same-sex marriage, we have a federal law that's in place right now, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, which was found unconstitutional. I believe wholly wrongly decided unconstitutionally, and of course the DOMA decision was the basis of the next case, which actually granted same-sex marriage to everybody. That's where I would start. I would start saying this was a decision that was extra constitutional. That law is good, valid law, and I will enforce that law. Now, it's much more difficult on the same-sex marriage case to have the federal government come in and say, okay, we're going to reinstitutionalize marriage as just between a man and a woman. This was a state case.
Yeah.
And so these are state laws. There's no federal marriage law other than the Defense of Marriage Act. So there is a limited response. Again, if I'm going to keep to what I've suggested, which is my role as a president, as the head of the federal government, I'm not going to go out and say, well, I'm going to change all the state laws. I can't do that. I wouldn't do that. But what I can do is enforce federal law on that subject matter.
And maybe encourage Congress to address the other problem
clearly,
through legislation that might aid the states in restoring their laws.
First Amendment Defense Act, which is something that I've been a very strong supporter of, which is on the margins of response to that. And secondly, supporting and advocating for a relook of this issue of marriage. I don't think we've really litigated this, and I don't mean in a legal sense, but really in a public relations sense. We haven't litigated this issue to the American public. And the consequences, which are just beginning to play out, have not really been, I don't think, understood by most Americans as to what this leads to. We can have a welcoming society, one that's tolerant and loving and supportive of everybody, irrespective of your sexual orientation, without fundamentally changing the pillar of our society.
Yeah. Thank you. That's it's good to be reminded that it's not about some, homophobic bigotry, but about defending.
Contrary to what the court said, this is not about animus. This is not about the idea that we don't love and care and respect and tolerate people who have different ideas of sexuality. It is changing fundamental structures of our society to accommodate that, and not recognizing the consequence of that change to the rest of society.
And changing the Constitution to effect that social change.
Exactly.
Justice Kennedy embraced the doctrine of the living Constitution, which is, well, anti-constitutional.
It's anti-constitutional, exactly.
You've mentioned the First Amendment Defense Act, and I'm glad you did. The Catholic bishops, our bishops, have expressed deep concerns over the future.
They're my bishops too.
I meant to include you in that. Our bishops, yours and mine, and most of our viewers, many of our viewers here on EWTN. The Catholic bishops have expressed deep concerns over the future of religious liberty, especially an emerging attempt to punish those of us who believe that marriage is the union of husband and wife. It's not just us Catholics, though. It's evangelicals, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, Eastern Orthodox Christians, others who have been penalized or fired from government jobs, or whose adoption agencies have been excluded from working to help orphan children find good homes. This has happened not just to Catholic Charities, but to Evangelical Lutheran Children's Services as well. And small business owners, as we know, have faced bankrupting fines by the government for declining to facilitate same-sex ceremonies, bakers, photographers, and so on.
And there are legions of others who are violating their conscience and going through a very difficult time personally and going along with the decision, even though it creates a real moral dilemma for them. So you're not even hearing of the cases of people who bow to the state, but do so with a very heavy moral consequence to their own psychology, their own emotional and spiritual being.
Driven by fear of penalty.
Exactly.
Now, in his very powerful Obergefell dissent, Chief Justice John Roberts on the Supreme Court warned, and I quote him, "The Solicitor General candidly acknowledged that the tax exemptions of some religious institutions would be in question if they opposed same-sex marriage." He went on, "There is little doubt that these and similar questions will soon be before this court. Unfortunately, people of faith can take no comfort in the treatment they receive from the majority today," end quote. Now, given the seriousness of these religious liberty threats, recognized even by the Chief Justice, what would you do as president to protect the rights of Christians and other dissenters from the new normal on marriage? Specifically, would you seek passage of the First Amendment Defense Act in your first?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best short-term answer, which is to create some space and create stop the federal government from pursuing through its regulatory structures or even through litigation or prosecution anybody in the business community or anyone who receives government service or government dollars for providing, for example, adoption services and the like. Creating that space to allow people to exercise their religious freedom in providing these services. And I know that's been twisted and turned by many in the media that we're legitimizing bigotry, but that goes to Robert's point, which is there's nothing in this opinion that gives you any sense that you're protected, because what the court found was that there's no rational basis for you to have an opinion that marriage should be between a man and a woman. So the only reason, again, according to the court, is that you hate gay people. That in the end, they said it specifically in DOMA, but they sort of alluded to it in the second case, which is, if you believe in traditional marriage, you believe in man-woman marriage, you simply do so because you hate, because there's no other reason you can support it. That's the real problem here, is that we've eliminated thousands of years of history as to what, and every cultural norm, natural law, everything you can think of, and said none of those things are real. They're all imagined. They're all constructions to protect. Can you imagine that thousands of years ago when marriage was instituted, that it was only instituted because people hated gay folks? I mean, that's the only reason that marriage was instituted.
Yeah, it's risible on the face of it. I mean, so if there's no rational basis to believe in man-woman marriage, then the new dispensation of reason, which is to embrace same-sex marriage as equal to man-woman marriage in law, that new dispensation of reason is now being used as a way of trumping the religiously grounded but altogether rational belief in man-woman marriage. So we who believe in marriage and have rational grounds for doing so and are bolstered in our belief by our faith and compelled by conscience to regard marriage in this way, we're now up against a new theory of what reason
You're outlaws.
commands.
You're outlaws.
So in a struggle between the new dispensation of reason and the ancient dispensations of our faith, how's this going to come out?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I fear how it's going to come out. I mean, if you look at how some of the cases are coming out right now, it's not encouraging.
Yeah.
It's not encouraging. You see businesses being put out of business. You see Catholic Charities and others who have been excluded. And I suspect, as Justice Roberts noted, that nonprofits are going to be
They're next.
They're next, and the nonprofit status and eligibility for grants and all those things, particularly if, depending on what happens in this next presidential race, if the party in power now stays in power in the White House, I don't think there's any question that this ball will start rolling. I think the president and his people now, within a year of the election, are not going to push this very hard. I think they realize that if they push this right before an election, that this issue will flare up again, and probably not going to be. Yes, it will validate all of the concerns that I think a lot of the American public has. I mean, even there are thoughtful people on the left who say, "Wait a minute, we can't." And even some gay and lesbian activists who said, "Wait, we can't go this far. We have to. If we've been arguing tolerance all these years, then we have to be tolerant also." But that's not where the left is. That's not where President Obama is. It's not where Hillary Clinton is. I just don't think they're going to do anything particularly dramatic between now and the election. But if they're successful, that will definitely happen. Definitely come.
Very worrisome. Thank you. In a related area, the Obama administration has issued a new ruling, I think from its education department, requiring every public school in America to give biological males who say they are psychologically female access to girls' showers, dressing areas, restrooms. The administration threatens school districts like the one in Palatine, Illinois, with the loss of federal funding if they refuse to comply. In Hillsborough, Missouri, hundreds of girls and boys walked out of the local high school to protest this invasion of their privacy. Now, this new uproar is happening at a time when many other parents are already upset at the way federal funding has been used to change the curriculum in 46 states via the Common Core, with little or no input from parents. And so I'll ask you, as president, what would you do to guarantee that federal funding will not be used to force school districts to require girls to shower with boys? And are there other things you would do to stem the growing misuse of regulations and testing and funding by the federal government and restore to parents and local communities control over their children's education?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest issues out there, not just on the issue of education, but the incredible overreach of the federal government using the regulatory process to get around congressional intent, to ignore the Congress altogether. But I don't know of any place that's more pernicious than in the area of education. And when I first came to the Congress back in 1991, the federal government made up 2% of all education funding for primary and secondary education. It's now 11%. And does anybody believe, any of your audience believe, that education has improved as a result of the increased amount of revenue that's now flowing to the states and school districts from the federal government? The answer is, with every dollar that comes from the federal government comes a string, and the string isn't helping provide better quality education that, well, I should say better quality, isn't providing the education that parents want. See, I believe that we have a fundamental misunderstanding in this country who the customer of the education system is in America. See, I don't think it's the student. The student isn't the customer. Well, why? Because who's responsible for the education of your child? You are.
You are.
Therefore, what are schools there for? They're there to help you.
Yeah.
They're not there to help your kids. Yes, I mean, ultimately, but the principal responsibility of educating a child is the parent's responsibility, and the school is there as an aid to give parents what they believe is in the best interest of their child. But that's not how education is developed in this country. It's not where it is today. And so whether it's Common Core or whether it's these other types of things that you've talked about, where the federal government comes in and say, we know best, what they're basically telling parents is, you don't know best what's best for your child. And we're going to come in there, whether it's the federal government, the state government, or even the school district, and says, we're going to force these things down your throat. And of course, the farther away, the less parents are involved in that actual decision. So I've written a couple of books that touch on this subject. One was a book called It Takes a Family, which I wrote 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now. And the other is called Blue Collar Conservative, which I wrote last year. And both talk on my principal focus is a revolution in American education. We need a parents' revolution. We need parents to say, we have a right, I hate to throw that term around, but we have a right to have our child get the education that I believe, or we believe as parents, is best for our children. And not what the state believes, not what the federal government believes, but what we believe. And we should be able to give our child whatever that particular course is, whether it's public schools, whether it's private schools, whether it's home schools, whether it's a combination of all three, or a charter school, whatever the case may be. Parents should be the ultimate, well, they have the ultimate responsibility, but they have none of the authority. They have none of the power. And I think that'll be my mission, is to go to the American public and say, open up your eyes and see that we accept a institutionalized view of primary and secondary education instead of one that has adapted to the 21st century where everybody gets customized everything. Anybody that goes in and says, we have one of these and everybody has to have the same. Yeah. You go to Walmart and everybody gets no, you have all sorts of options and choices. The same thing can be made available in our education, particularly with technology now. But we don't, because we have all of these institutions and structures and the way we do things. So I'm probably different than most Republicans who want to fix the system. I don't want to fix the system. I want the system to change fundamentally, to adapt to the needs and desires of parents.
I seem to recall that first book of yours, It Takes a Family, that title was a bit of a riff on and an answer to.
It was a response to
a very famous book by Secretary of State. She was
Yes.
not then Secretary of State, but First Lady, I think, when she
First Lady.
wrote her book.
Yeah.
It Takes a Village, Hillary Clinton. And of course, you know, folks who encounter that "it takes a village" argument quickly find out that it really means it takes the state.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's our choice. That's our alternative, as you see it. Is
Absolutely.
the family or the state.
And so we have, on education, we have said the state.
Right.
And the state has taken control when the responsibility is the parents.
Yeah.
State have the power, responsibility is the parent. And I always say, look, the biggest problem in education today is not the education system, it's the breakdown of the family. And part of the I believe that the way we can help rebuild the family is to integrate the family more into the education experience, and to involve and create a much more nurturing environment that says, parents, you know, you are responsible, and we're going to give you the tools to be able to help you and encourage you. And the tools aren't necessarily money, but it can be as simple as providing information and research and support for parents to have their children prepared to learn in their earlier years. I think it was I'm trying to remember I think it was Robert Putnam who you know, wrote a book recently and said that it's more important for a parent to read to their children in the first 4 years of life than it is to pay for 4 years of college education.
Wow.
And so sort of creating an atmosphere where we orient all the education toward parents, I think we'll be surprised and pleasantly surprised how parents will respond to that in our society.
Now, it doesn't sound like you would, I mean, there are some positive policy steps you would have the federal government undertake. So it doesn't sound like you want to get the federal government entirely out of American education.
Much. Yeah, pretty much out. I mean, I don't really see the roles that I was talking about. Really, I don't necessarily see the federal government other than potentially providing information and the like. But as far as funding is concerned, the only funding I really see as essential funding is to help some of these school districts in particular that have a high proportion of special needs kids, and most of those are poorer school districts. You probably need some continued support from the federal level, but that's a very, very small percentage.
So a Santorum family-centered education policy could maybe do without the Federal Department of Education?
You know,
maybe.
Yeah, the answer is yes. The problem with getting rid of the Department of Education, it's like getting rid of any of these departments. It sounds great. Oh, we're going to get rid of this department, that department. The problem is you got all these laws that are in place. And so you can't get rid of a department until you get rid of the laws, because the laws are still there. Someone needs to enforce them. Yeah. And so you just can't say, oh, get rid of the education department. Okay, fine. Well, who's going to enforce the Elementary School Act, all these, the IDEA? All of those have to be enforced by somebody. So you can get rid of the department, but somebody else is going to end up doing it. The question is, can you get rid of the laws? And the answer is yes. That's what I'm going to be focused on, is taking these laws and getting rid of the federal involvement in these things, repealing them or scaling them back to the point where they can be shifted back down and focus on the parents.
Great. You know, our friend Robbie George likes to say that the family is the original Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Absolutely.
And it couldn't be more true. The Catholic Church, our church, Senator Santorum, teaches that there is a preferential option for the poor. Catholics believe that the first question to be asked about any proposed policy is, what is its impact on the weakest and most vulnerable members of our community? The unborn, cognitively disabled, physically handicapped, mentally or physically impaired, those people mired in poverty. Now, it's true, of course, that policies that help those who are already well off can also help the less well off by creating employment opportunities, promoting general prosperity. But what in particular would you propose to do to help middle class and poor Americans?
Yeah, I guess when I look at it sort of two different ways. Number one, what do we do to help the economy? And then what do we do to help the family? Because I think if we don't have a policy that helps strengthen the American family, I always say, the word economy comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. And so the first economy is in the home. And I think Robbie would agree. It's the first hospital, first school, but it's also the first economy. And the fact of the matter is that one of the reasons the middle of America is hollowing out is because the family is breaking down, and those two-parent families were the heart of the middle of America. It was what kept America beating, with these strong family relationships. Again, I go back to Robert Putnam, who wrote this book recently called Our Kids. And reading that book, I don't know if you've read it yet, but it's devastating to read what's went on in his hometown of Port Clinton, Ohio. And he talks about growing up in the 50s and the kids on the other side of the tracks who were poor and who'd had a tough life. And all of them did pretty well, but all of them, almost all of them, came from two-parent families. Even though they were poor, they had stable families, or there are others in the community who could pick up the role of fathers and mentor. And today he went back and he looks at those same folks on the other side of the track. And there are no dads, there's no marriage, and these kids are just, it's hopeless.
Putnam is a Harvard political scientist and no conservative.
No, he was invited to the White House.
Follows the data where they
follows the data. And so if you talk about the economy, you have to talk about the impact of fatherlessness and the lack of marriage, and particularly in our minority communities, because it is devastating, the impact. And so the first priority of the Santorum administration would be to use the most powerful tool that I have to advance the cause of the family. And of course, that's the bully pulpit. Imagine what the president has done in the last 7 years with the issue of climate change.
Oh my.
He's used the regulatory and executive order authority, but he hasn't passed a single law on climate change. Yet, this country has definitely changed. And there has been a clear impact of the president's using his authority that this is the most important issue and what we need to do as a society to address it. I would use that and then some to talk about the importance of the nuclear family, talk about the importance of marriage. I wrote in my book, It Takes a Family, about an organization from Chattanooga, Tennessee called First Things First, which is a group that came together once it was disclosed in a newspaper article that Chattanooga had some of the highest divorce rates, high out-of-wedlock birth rates, teen drug abuse, dropout rates, things like that. And the city fathers were stunned by this in this beautiful little town in southeast Tennessee. And they did something about it. They formed a nonprofit. They got the business community together with the educators, parents, civic organizations, churches, government. They all came together and put together a program, no government dollars to speak of, and did something in their community to try to reclaim marriage and family and fatherhood, and had curriculum in the schools, had advertising campaigns, got businesses to be involved in nurturing. I was in a business about a year or so ago in Chattanooga, and I asked them, because I hadn't been to Chattanooga for a while, I said, do you guys do anything here to sort of support the family? And he said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. We have we found out the number one problem with our families is financial, that causes breakup. So we provide a free Dave Ramsey course for a weekend to teach them how to properly budget. And second, we provide a free marriage retreat once a year.
Wow.
For our employees, because we know that stable families create better employees and create a stronger workplace for us. Those are things that nobody talks about. Nobody talks about the impact of family. And so, first, how do we deal with it? Family. Second, I believe the missing ingredient in America today is blue-collar jobs. The manufacturing jobs that created the wealth that built America and built the world. And we are continuing to hemorrhage manufacturing jobs, in large part because of our high tax rates and a very strict regulatory environment. We now have an advantage with $30 oil potentially, very cheap natural gas. Our energy prices now are competitive with the rest, exceed anybody in the world. We have China, thankfully. Wages are starting to go up there because of their demographic shift. And so we now have an opportunity to bring a lot of those jobs back here to America if we could get a tax and regulatory structure that would work for this country to be competitive. That's what my whole economic plan is centered around. It's a 20% flat tax. It's one that provides particular incentives for manufacturing because it allows for full expensing for capital and equipment, and it even has a transition period for manufacturing. It has a repatriation provision, which says that if you're Apple and you have $100 billion sitting overseas, you can bring that money back and not pay 40%, but pay 10%. All of these things are incentives to bring money back, to bring jobs back, and create the opportunities for the 74% of Americans who are aged 25 to 65 who don't have a college degree. Wow. And again, another bully pulpit thing I would use is talking about the importance of manual labor, the importance of working in trades and skills and factories, about America recommitting to being the place where things are made, and taking pride in that, not looking down our nose, well, you don't have a college degree and therefore, it's not a good job. There are 250,000 welder jobs open in America today. I was told that by a company that does education for welders. 250,000. Starting salary is about $40,000 a year. But starting salary, $40,000 a year. It can go as high as $110,000, $115,000 a year if you're going to weld pipelines, for example. That's sort of the highest paying end. That's a president should be talking about how we can make America strong again, how we can be that muscular society that makes things, build things, and creates things for the world. And we do on some fronts, but we miss that when it comes to a lot of the lower skilled workers in our society and giving them an opportunity to rise.
So you envision a sort of a multi-front campaign. There's tax policy, perhaps industrial policy,
regulatory policy, trade policy, immigration policy, family, the whole bunch, family policy.
You began our conversation by referring first and foremost to faith as a pillar of our society. President George W. Bush started the Office of Faith-Based Partnerships in the White House. I think in the Obama administration, it's kind of been sidelined. Is that something you would revive as an element of a Santorum White House?
Yeah, I would have to think about that again, because this gets into another deep area, is how much I've seen the government in partnering with faith, robbing these faith-based institutions of their faith. Mm. And that was a concern when and I was a supporter of it. That was a concern when we first set it up. How much would government involvement in contracting with faith-based organizations actually erode what makes these faith-based organizations so successful? And certainly I've seen that in this administration, that anybody that receives government funds is constrained by these funds as to how faith-oriented they can be. And so I'd have to think about, the answer is I would love to see more faith-based organizations be more engaged and involved in being these armies of compassion, use the President Bush's word. These mediating institutions in our society, they're absolutely essential. The question is how directly involved should the government be, and that would be a subject area I would encourage, but would be cautious as to how we do that.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I have one more major policy area I want to raise with you, Senator. We're a nation of immigrants, your ancestors and mine. We came here, they came here from other places. Immigration has always been a source of strength for our country. Millions have come to America and become productive and patriotic citizens. Many of them came here quite poor, ill-educated. The Catholic bishops have long favored a version of comprehensive immigration reform that would combine a generous, welcoming policy for illegal immigrants and humane treatment that does not involve mass deportation or the separation of families for persons who are not here legally. Do you agree with the bishops or disagree with aspects of the position they've taken? How would you handle generally the immigration issue?
Yeah, I take the position that immigration is a good thing. My father was an immigrant to this country, so I'm a first-generation American. And of course we are a nation of immigrants, but it's like anything else. Can there be too much of a good thing? And some people would say, no, we just need unlimited and let sort of everything work out. Well, here's the reality. Over the last 20 years, there have been 35 million both legal and illegal immigrants come into this country, more than any other period of time in American history. And about 90% of those people that have come in are wage earners. And if you look at that, during that same period of time, wages have gone up at the lowest level in the history of our country. And so you can't say that there's not a connection between supply and demand. That if you're bringing in historic numbers of lower skilled workers, and you have Americans, another number, it's the year 2000 to the year 2014, last year, there were 5.7 million net new jobs created. Of those net new jobs, every single one is held by someone who's not born in this country. There are actually fewer native-born Americans working in America today than there was 15 years ago. Now, again, immigration is a good thing, but can we look back and say that since 1990, when we changed the immigration laws in this country, and we've had historically huge levels, larger than any period of time in American history, can we take a step back and say, has this been a good thing? Has it been a bad thing? Are there some tweaks that we can make that would make it better? And not get into, well, if you want to talk about this issue of immigration and talk about any kind of limit on immigration, well, then you're anti-immigrant. You're not anti-immigrant if you want to look at how immigration, I always say this, when I say the word immigration policy, it should be the same reaction as if you said the word tax policy. Now, when you asked me about my tax policy, you didn't ask me, well, how do you treat people overseas on your tax policy? Or how do you treat people who broke the tax laws? You don't ask me those questions. You ask me, well, how does it treat Americans who are struggling? Well, the same should be the case with immigration. Immigration is not just about those who are overseas or those who have come into this country. It's also about the people who are in this country and how it impacts them. And to have this conversation and not talk about them, I think is disingenuous, and I think it creates this dichotomy that you're either for unlimited immigration or you're anti-immigrant. Right. I'm not anti-immigrant, but I am for an immigration system that works well both for immigrants and for Americans. And so I've taken the position that we need to actually take the number of legal immigrants, which is about 1,050,000 a year, and get rid of two immigration categories which have proven to be problematic. One is called a visa lottery system, which brings in immigrants, 50,000 a year, from third world countries, most of whom are hostile to this country. And I'm not alone in this. In fact, it was in the bipartisan bill that I didn't support, but it did get rid of this system. Why? Because it is problematic. And it also gets rid of something called chain migration, which is not just bringing in your minor children and your spouse, but you can now bring in your parents and your brothers and sisters, and you can bring in their spouses, and then they can bring in their spouses. Wow. Their brothers and sisters and their parents. And so from one person, you get this huge chain. And again, it's not a rational way of doing immigration policy, particularly given the fact that many of these are coming from third world countries. And so what I've suggested, let's get rid of these two programs and then leave the rest of the numbers, which would be about 750,000 people, alone, and let's work on moving a system that that provides opportunities for the poor, the huddled masses yearning to be free to come, and also provides an opportunity for those who can add to the economy of our country to come in this, to have a little bit more merit-based system than what is now almost exclusively a family-based system of education, of immigration. And finally, on the illegal side, I take this, just look at the facts. Half of the people who are in this country illegally, roughly, are here on visa overstays. Mm. So these are people who came to this country usually for a job. And
they could have come from all four corners of the world.
They could have come from anywhere. Yeah. They can come from Canada, Mexico, Britain, France. I mean, these are not your huddled masses yearning to be free. These are people who came in because they wanted to come for a job, or they went to a college here. Many of them came for student visas. Many of them came on vacation, so they had the money to come and go on vacation. So they're visitor visa, student visa, work visas, and they didn't go home. And that's half the people in this country. We know who they are. We have their names. We probably know how to contact each and every one of them. And the idea that they should be allowed to stay when they promised that they would go home, and that they're not people who are by and large here for some other reason other than it's been economically profitable for them to come here, the answer for them is very simple. Go home. If you go home, I'm not going to prejudice you for being able to come back. So we're not going to say, because you overstayed your visas, you're not going to be able to come back. We'll treat you like everybody else. But if you don't go home and we have to remove you, then you can't come back ever again. I just that we make it just very, very clear. Now you've now taken the 12 million, you've reduced it to 6. And again, you go back and look at the same situation, which is, do I want to separate families? Of course not. But we do it all the time in America. When people break the law, sometimes they get separated from their family. They have to go to jail. Why? Because they broke the law. Mm-hmm. And so I believe in treating people fairly, but I believe in justice. And the reality is, it's not just for millions of people in this, and now in this country, who were from all over the world, who waited in line, who made sacrifice. My father was separated from his father for the first 7 years of his life because my grandfather came here and couldn't bring him in till he was a citizen. Was that hard on my family? My father tells me it was very hard because he was growing up in Mussolini's Italy. But the reality is, we played by the rules, and that's what America is about, playing by the rules. And when we say, no, you're going to be treated differently, we don't teach people the right lesson, and we don't do what's in the best interest of our country.
Well, I want to thank Senator Santorum for joining us on Candidate Conversations. It's been a real pleasure, Senator.
Thank you, Matthew.
And I know that Robbie George appreciates your prayers. And
he will have them, the whole family.
And he'll be looking forward to the next time he sees you. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again for the next Candidate Conversations 2016.